Today, I'm talking with Anika Gupta, author of How to Handle a Crowd, the Art of Creating Healthy and Dynamic Online Communities. And Fiona Macquarie from Pop Matters called it a fascinating peek into largely overlooked part of the online world. And Anika, you and I have had some great conversations over the last few months about everything and anything. So I'm delighted to chat to you about the next decade today. And just to give you some kind of preamble context, I have developed this kind of emerging ideology around the idea that this particular decade is going to be one of great change, and that the world, the culmination or the conflagration of technological change and social change coming together over the next decade is going to result in something, some significant ruptures in systems that we've gotten used to, and some novel ideologies emerging to take their places. So you're very welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me here, John. It's great to chat with you. So
we've got the first question I like to start with is a question about how you see today. So before we talk about tomorrow, understanding what it is that you are considering as significant today. So are there any themes or trends that you're looking at the moment that you think these are really important things that maybe people aren't considering?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the framing I'd use, John, it's so interesting, and you and I love to talk about the future. So the framing I'd use is to think about, as somebody who's spent the past, few years studying the internet and online communities in particular, I've been really thinking about what's shaping that space and what's happening there. And so I did a whole bunch of research into online communities. I started interviewing people who run online communities, online moderators. And I think it's been really interesting to watch that space. And I think there are a couple of reasons. The first is, of course, that we are kind of motivated, as a result of this, global pandemic that has totally changed all of our lives. We are in this position where we're living so much more of our lives online, and we're doing things online that a lot of us didn't anticipate or didn't know how to do. And so a lot of questions like, who has access to the internet? How do you moderate an effective discussion? How do you include differences? I think we're all becoming moderators. And I think that's sort of a really interesting, or not we're all, but many people are suddenly finding themselves in this role of moderator. For example, teachers of classes who hadn't anticipated it. So I think this is a really key moment for us when it comes to thinking about how we as a society handle not just things we enjoy online, but also how do we administer essential services online, and what does that mean? So that's been a really interesting thing to think about. The other thing that I had a bit of a tipping point for what I think of as online moderation. When I first started studying online moderation, which was, 5 or 6 years ago, it was a field that that people didn't know a lot about, right? Sometimes people knew, yeah, somebody's hopping into unruly online discussions and commenting, but nobody really had a sense of what that work was. And I think over the past several years, thanks in part to some amazing investigative journalism, some great academic writing, we've become so much more aware of moderation. I think I focused a lot in my book on community moderation, which is, people who are the moderator who's jumping into the thread, who's known to their community. But there's this other side, which is content moderation, which are, often moderators who've been contracted by big social media firms to look at objectionable content. And that's where we've seen a lot of awareness grow. So now, it used to be that people believed Facebook was just completely, and from Facebook's side, and we now know that's totally untrue. And they have all of these many contract moderators across the world. And they recently came to this big settlement with them, $52 million it was, to compensate some of these contract moderators for the trauma they suffered on the job. And so I think that, and there is a company saying that, we need to think about ways to make moderation more visible. And so I think that we're becoming aware of how much labor goes into shaping the online experience that we see. And I think that is something that is hopefully going to continue. I think that awareness is good for us to have. So I think both of those have been really interesting trends to observe. Again, coming from this framework of somebody who thinks a lot about online communities in particular.
It's such a fascinating space, and both sides of it, mods and moderators. So that the space of moderators just been stories, and I've seen instances of people. There've been a number, I think, of um, outsource moderators, and it's this invisible
Hmm.
mechanical Turk that seems to sit behind the well-running kind of well-oiled machines of social media
Hmm.
platforms that we've become accustomed to. But the things these people are exposed to are it's the most extreme content that any generation of people has ever
Hmm.
seen, ever witnessed. So
Yeah,
even people
absolutely.
who would have been police, who would have been homicide police,
Hmm.
or vice police
Hmm.
over decades prior, they would never have experienced exposure to the level of extreme content,
Absolutely.
both violent and sexual content, that these people
Hmm.
are seeing
Yeah.
every day. That must result in trauma.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in that sense. It's a really interesting job. I mean, my background is in journalism. And so, I remember when I was in school, journalists, many journalists anyway, especially in this traditional mindset, the job could be really traumatic because you'd be traveling to like, all over. You'd be traveling to the site of like, oftentimes tragedies and disasters and talking to people about them. And so, I remember people kind of talking about some of those challenges, but I think the extent to which moderators face it, the way in which they have to face it, I think is really different. I mean, and even for community moderators whom I studied, who are not necessarily looking at that, they're dealing with like the full spectrum of human emotion on like a daily basis, and so it's a
Yeah,
very human emotion, human reaction and response. And it's really exhausting, and it generates a lot of value for like companies where these discussions are
sure.
hosted, even though it's not always adequately compensated. So I think those are like, I mean, I think that's it. There's also this related question, right, John, that we see at least in the United States of like, you know online communities in some ways are great because people find like a home in them, but we've also seen that there's so many examples of like both toxic online communities and people kind of from other communities of like brigading or destroying what
Mm.
feels like a healthy community. And so and then there's this related question of like, if we only stay in our online kind of neighborhoods, then do we encounter dissent or differing viewpoints, and what does that mean for our political future? And so I think there are people who have suggested that like there are ways in which this sort of increased isolation of different online communities from each other that can exist is actually really bad for society. So I mean,
Sure.
I have a lot of thoughts in response to that. I think that's a question with a lot of assumptions and a lot of complicating factors. But I think like the extent to which online communities are going to help us move forward, like as just a philosophy, that's a really interesting debate. I mean, especially here in the US going into an election, where
Yeah.
election misinformation and manipulation is like a huge concern with social media.
So let me draw a couple of these points together. You've just written a book on it, so I want to explore it as much as possible, but also to pull that point you just made in to a point to mods, whatever else.
Hmm.
So um, it strikes me that for the moderators that are employed typically as outsourced workers for these big social media platforms, they're not directly employed, and they tend to be paid a very small salary typically as well. They're effectively the menial labor of the internet, and
Mm.
it kind of strikes me that there would likely be a high potential for those people to be radicalized by a lot of the content they see. Is that something that you stumbled across in your own research? Does that happen?
You know, it's a great question. There, the answer is not, I think, in the way you're thinking. What I did see is, so when I started out, I was interviewing people who worked as moderators, but within the online news space. And so I think when I think about like not necessarily radicalization, but I definitely talked to a couple people who interviews in other academic papers with people who expressed kind of a loss of faith as a result of
Mm,
having had to deal with like not just like these really dark elements and viewpoints online, but also the fact that they didn't get really much support sometimes from their management or their company for dealing with it. And it kind of, for some of them, it meant like they just lost interest in working in journalism, or they lost faith, one of them said, in like the promise of journalism and some of its functions online. Like this idea that you can have a productive discussion online that like moves you forward. I talked to someone who told me that they believed that was no longer possible. And so I think that that's definitely not radicalization, but it's a massive change.
yeah.
That's a really interesting question. I personally haven't, like, are people being radicalized toward extreme viewpoints? And what
Anti-vaxxers
role does
or
this?
flat
Yeah,
earthers or QAnon.
yeah. play, to be totally honest with you, really something I personally have seen
Sure.
a lot of reading and writing around. There are, I mean, people are being radicalized online for sure, you know, and there are certain communities that are being looked at, certain Chan sites, for example, as like kind of places that
Yep.
encourage, you know, moving towards more radical positions. So that exists, but I think that's a really great question about like how being a moderator or even a person of authority in those communities influences your worldview.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I would go research it right now.
It's a curious, because it strikes me that if the dynamic that we have in our everyday is that 99% of the news that we consume is usually high fidelity. It's created by a journalist, and it's edited, and it's published by a publication that there is some comeback towards if there's a problem. But that 1% is the abstract stuff that could be total conspiracy nonsense, that is opinion, positioned as editorial or whatever else. But for people who work in these kind of moderator farms, it's the opposite. 99% of the content they absorb every day is the extreme. And that kind of made me think that the potential, if you were seeing QAnon stuff all day, every day, at what point do you begin to feel like there's so much of this stuff, maybe there's something to it, or anti-vax stuff or whatever it is. But to use that to segue, because I think one of the interesting dynamics, because the term is moderator for both of these groups, but it always strikes me that they're kind of polar ends of the digital spectrum. So one group, the group we just talked about, the moderators that work for these companies that clean up our digital scraps, so that they tidy away all the things that are unseemly and unsightly, and they get rid of them and make sure the internet doesn't cause a problem for mainstream audience, versus the mods that work typically are volunteers rather than being paid. So in the real world sense, you've got this economic imbalance, but in the digital world, mods are important people. If you're the mod of a big community, you're like digital aristocracy. You know, you're well up the hierarchy.
100%. Yeah.
It's this peculiar dynamic. So I'm sure you saw lots of interesting things. One that comes to mind is on Reddit is the free folk derivative subreddit that came from the Game of Thrones. That whole drama that emerged out of that was all based around a mod, and there's been a ton of those over the years as well. So are there any stories that come to mind when looking at the mod side of this that really caught your attention and made you think, oh, this is a new way of being for digital communities?
I think the question that you're pointing to, the tension that you're pointing to over like what it means to internally and externally like validate and compensate moderation work is so interesting, because you're right. And this is that when you are a moderator, you have this position of extraordinary power in your community, you know, and other people in your community can see that. And so you're, and so there is this like asymmetry, you know, in the sense that you'll often have access to tools and information that other members of your community don't, and sometimes they're aware of that. Reddit is a great example, because there have been like a lot of like incidents where you've had moderators kind of especially of like popular subreddits, really take a stand, the Reddit blackout being a very famous example, take a stand and try and say, you know, as moderators, as people who are so responsible and take on so much ownership of this community, we should be consulted more by the admins and the leadership in, you know, product decisions and community decisions that affect us. And, you know, so it's kind of it's a really interesting argument, because it's saying, you know, even if you're not going to pay us money, you have to kind of create space for us and acknowledge our significance as co-creators of value. And so I think that's definitely like a framing. I think Reddit's been a great example, but I even talked to this person, Juliet Eldred, who started a group called New Urbanist Memes for Transit-Oriented Teens on Facebook. Are you familiar with it?
No.
It's a phenomenon. And so she started it when she was like a college student interested in urbanism and urban issues. And it was kind of a group where people would just like post their frustrations with the city, but also like bond over things like their passion for better bike lanes and, you know, all of that. And so it became kind of unexpectedly like morphed into this massive group, and like, you know, has and the work of moderating it became like really epic for her. And then it spawned like several spin-off groups, each with their own like kind of culture and identity and philosophies, but like related to the original. And so it's been a really interesting phenomenon to watch, and she's been interviewed about it in like many places, and I talked to her as well. And it was just it was a really interesting, like, one of the questions that one of the things she mentioned, is that, you know, she's been really frustrated with kind of how this role of moderator has evolved for her. And, you know, it's a lot of work. And one of the discussions that came up in their group was whether or not moderation constitutes, you know, what we would think of as emotional labor. And furthermore, that the moderator should be compensated. And so when I talked to her about this, one of the things that she talked about was, you know, this idea of, well, should the platforms be asked to pay us, right? And that's like a big question for community moderators. Of course, you know, again, platforms don't necessarily pay moderators, and when they do, it's not necessarily a lot of money. And then, but the other thing they had done is they had, and several services have done this, they'd implemented a service that's kind of a digital tip jar for moderators. So if you're a member of the community, you can actually go and like give them a little tip, and every so often when she'd collected a certain amount, she would kind of like cash it out and like divide it among the team. And it translated to very little money, but I think it was a really interesting idea, like, since you're a member of the community, how do you kind of support the work that the moderators are doing, and how do you talk about and think about it? So that was kind of a really interesting manifestation.
Yeah, platforms asking the users to pay for the moderators instead of paying for the moderators that the platform needs themselves. Yeah, like that is such a dynamic that we've become accustomed to in the internet age. It's kind of that itself, I think, is emotionally exhausting. But
oh yeah, totally.
It's what the amount of money these companies make. You think they could find some space to at least provide benefits of some sort to the moderators in a show of acknowledgement and appreciation.
You think?
Yeah, you would think, but you know, anything you can do not to unintentionally employ somebody. So so are there any kind of specific groups, communities, or technologies? You mentioned one there a moment ago, but that you look at now and you think it's actually really important to keep an eye on this, and it may be coherent with a particular theme. So I think when we went back 4 or 5 years, we would have seen that there was a real emerging energy in social communities around Black Lives Matter at the time. And it was fascinating because it was both authentic groups on Instagram and on Facebook and in other places about Black Lives Matter, and it was politically engaged. But there was also groups that were that were Russian-owned groups from the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg that were set up as living kind of troll farms to try and create division. So it became this like live battleground theme at the time. Is there anything you're kind of looking at now and you're thinking that's a group or even a technology that's being utilized in some way that we should be keeping an eye on right now because it's going to have some sort of deterministic effect on the world that we live in over the next decade?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, the ways in which activists and Black activists use like social media as a site of resistance and a way to shape dialogue is fascinating, and there's some great research around it. So I think it's great for you to point it out, and as something that has definitely shaped and affected kind of the current moment and the conversations we're having. I think, I mean, in terms of kind of to go to like this on the technology side of it, I think the things that are interesting to me, or the question that I think we think about, is like, what does it mean to be, well, couple, I would say. One is like, what does it mean to be like the next generation of like social media? You know, so I think that we've seen social media companies come into existence, what we think of as social media companies, and we've discovered a lot of the flaws in that model, right? Like one of these challenges being, you know, the role of like the so-called consumer versus the producer, and like this sort of, you know, unfortunate conglomeration of labor. And I don't think that's necessarily going away, by the way. But I think that I think it's interesting to think about like tools and companies and platforms that enable people to like to resist some of the ways that social media monetizes us. So I think like the movement away from Facebook in favor of like greater privacy has been like a really interesting one. This idea that you don't want your information harvested. Of course, in Europe you have laws about that. In the United States we do in California, but not necessarily in that same way broadly. You have GDPR, but also, we have. So I think like that kind of. I think this question of like what it means to like be a digital citizen, what it means to have digital privacy is really interesting. But also like this, so then in that space of like what's coming after social media, I think of like, I use a platform as somebody who plays a lot of online games. I use Discord fairly extensively. And I think Discord is really interesting because it gives you a lot of the functionality of a social network. I mean, it gives you really all of it. But it's in this like curated space. So you create your own Discord server, you can make it invite only, etc. So, unlike Twitter, which is like by definition profoundly public, and Facebook, which is often public and often public in ways you as a person on Facebook don't realize. I think it's interesting to think about like to think about like spaces that offer either greater control or more illusion of control over like your information and who sees what you put online. So I think that's like a really interesting, and there's like a ton of, there are like a lot of companies that are trying to create. So I think that's one area. There are companies that are trying to create like sort of connection, whatever, like, and that can mean like creating formats that allow you to better experience a digital event, that allow you to like have an online conversation with greater depth and humanity, and people trying to tackle those questions, which I think is really interesting. So these are like some of the trends I think that are interesting. I think this like continued idea of technology as like an instrument of the state, and how our digital technology is being used by the state and how different actors respond to that is like a really, that's a profound thing we're going to continue to see a lot of evolution around and conversation around as we move forward. So those are like some of the things that I think I think about a lot. On a very personal level, I am very interested in things like the future evolution of like, AR tools for like, digital gaming, for example. But I think broadly, like those are some of the things that I think are going to be really interesting.
Yeah, we did a piece last year on privacy, the future of privacy, what it would look like in 10 years' time.
That's right, you did, yeah.
Kind of choose your own adventure narrative. And it's such a complex topic, and it speaks directly to that point about the way the state leverages technology. Ultimately, ostensibly on our behalf, but ultimately to our detriment to at least some extent. And it's a really complex dynamic because we desire more utility through technology, and that's going to mean significantly more technology in our urban infrastructure. So cameras and sensors everywhere, significant use of drones, significant use of communications technology through 5G and then 6G presumably afterwards. And that will present us with an enormous opportunity for urban landscapes to become very, very dynamic canvases for mixed reality and kind of hyper extended and enhanced reality. I think that's going to be fascinating. But the other side of that is it means total obsolescence of privacy in public space, that it's entirely obviated.
Yeah, and it's a privacy with a lot of implications, or absence of privacy with a lot of implications, because again, if we think about like state surveillance as something that happens when you're in those spaces, like, it raises a lot of questions about who is able to be there, who is visible, how they're treated, what that says about your attitude towards the state. There's a lot of questions of equality in there.
Yeah, one big kind of consideration I have at the moment, so obviously there are a myriad of differences between the analog world and the digital world, but one that always strikes me is that there is a total absence of public spaces in the digital world. It doesn't exist. Everywhere, every single digital footprint steps on territory that's owned by somebody. It is an entirely private universe and expanding all the time. But every single, digital centimeter of it is owned by somebody. Whereas in the real world, there are public spaces for the common good that are not owned by anybody, that are to either service the citizens of the country, or in some places indeed the world, that they're international in their orientation. And I have concerns about the idea of private businesses being able to commercialize data through monitoring in public spaces. And I think that that is this novel type of privatization that is probably looming. The idea that you can sell, an urban council or a city council could sell the airspace between kind of 3 meters and 8 meters in
Mm-hmm.
5 city blocks to a particular private business.
Mm-hmm.
That has huge implications, but they're so complex that it's very, very difficult for people to actually contest legislation that facilitates that, if legislation is
Mm-hmm.
required, because it's too complex for people to understand. I think that's a concern I have over, that's a very live concern right now and can be very
Yeah.
real in the next 10 years. And I would certainly expect in certain countries that
Mm-hmm.
will become reality in the next couple of years, given the advancements
Mm-hmm.
that we've seen in China,
Yeah.
particularly over the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like countries like the US and
Mm-hmm.
Brazil and India are likely to follow. And
Mm-hmm.
it obviously gets coupled with geopolitical agendas in those countries as well. I mean, the
Yeah.
US geopolitical agenda is reasonably widely known, but obviously in Brazil
Mm-hmm.
there is this real appetite for personal data at the moment. India as well. I mean, given
Oh
the
yeah.
Muslim political situation in India at the moment and what's
Mm-hmm.
happened to Muslim communities in India,
Yeah.
there is a real appetite for more and more data to de-citizenize or de-platform certain people because of sectarian reasons. So I think that's going to be a really dangerous environment, and it's obviously going to create a new type of inequality. So we're used to inequality based on gender, or based on race, or based on sex, or based on age, or based on like class, maybe more than
Mm-hmm.
anything else
Yeah.
over time,
Mm-hmm.
and wealth. There's this new inequality that's emerging that's based on your capacity to be private and your ability to hold on to your own data. That's a new form of privilege, which I think is going to be fascinating. And it doesn't, in my view anyway, the solution is not going to be that you move to rural environments. That is going to be a form of isolation for a lot of people that
Mm-hmm.
mean that you opt out a lot of the economic benefits of
Yeah.
partaking in these new digitalized city states. But it's that you've just kind of hit
Mm-hmm.
a light bulb with me. It's a topic that I feel quite strongly about. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is, I mean, you're right to point it out as something that deserves its own study and has been getting it, but also as something that very much intersects with and springs from existing inequalities
Mm.
and, and is related to them. So yeah,
Okay.
you're
So
totally right.
well, to conclude then, what do you think the world will look like in 10 years' time? How would you begin to answer that question? Obviously, you
Mm-hmm.
can't speak to everything, but are there things that are really on your mind that you're very concerned about, that are huge opportunities that you expect to see come into reality in 10 years' time?
Well, I mean, you know, um, we were talking about this a little earlier, John, and we were saying that there's both, a light and a dark timeline, as well as several in between. And so I think a lot of the choices we make will be influential. I mean, going back to your point about, I guess one of the sort of thoughts around on the lighter timeline side of it is you asked this question around like, what does it mean to have digital public space and truly digital public space, and what does that look like, and who trusts it? And while I think that question is a hard one to resolve. I will say that, the Ethan Zuckerman, the leader of the Center for Civic Media at MIT for many years, whom I knew because, I had met him when I was there, is now leaving MIT, and he's starting a new center for, I want to say, digital public infrastructure. And they're going to be trying to ask some of these questions. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see how that question evolves. I think that there's definitely a version of the future in which we have what we had traditionally thought of as public spaces, digital public spaces, right? I mean, this whole question right now in the United States of like how you vote when physical voting is disrupted, and like the really inadequate answers we've been finding kind of indicate that like we're going to evolve in this area. We're going to continue to think about what it means to host like free and fair elections in a world where we have like social media and internet as like constant influences. And so I think that's going to be that's one of the things that's going to continue to evolve, and we'll see how that goes. I think we're going to continue to see people like live more functions digitally. I think that's beginning now, forced by the pandemic. But really, like a lot of things, like education. I think education is just in the midst of an enormous change right now, and it's going to continue to be in the midst of that change, right? Like you have like, schools going all virtual, at least here in the US, schools going all virtual, colleges going all virtual, students asking questions about whether they should have to like pay tuition in the same way, if that's the case, because it's a different experience. So some of those really tough questions about like, not only how do we deliver online experiences, but how do we value them?
Sure.
I think this kind of goes back to the question of moderation too, is that I think there's this perception that things that happen on the internet are inherently less expensive, or there's somehow a different and I think that that's going to shift, and I think that we're going to start seeing more and more that
Mm.
digital experiences are a creature in their own right, with their own possibilities and their own they're not some like distant second. And I think that that's going to be really interesting in terms of when we think about like what do we pay for online experiences, because I think that's going to need to happen. I think that's something that's happening now. I think moderators are kind of one glimpse into how that question is evolving, but I think education now is another. So
That's the key, isn't
that's
it? So it's the
yeah.
difference between having like a new movie is released and having a mixed reality experience with that
Hmm.
new movie in your own home in a dynamic way,
Hmm.
and having somebody hold a camera up in the cinema to live stream the movie as it's
Hmm.
been played on a cinema screen onto
Hmm.
your phone, which is I think is
Yeah.
the analogy for a university experience in the US right now. People
Hmm.
are being charged the same amount of money for that second
Hmm.
experience, and
Hmm.
universities are trying to suggest to them that actually no, it's the first mixed reality dynamic
Hmm.
kind of immersive
Hmm.
experience, which obviously it's not.
Yeah.
So that's okay. That kind of fascinating perspective on the future, and I
Hmm.
think kind of running out of time as well. So Anika, thank you so much for
Hmm.
joining me. I really appreciate it. Your book is called How to Handle a Crowd: The Art of Creating
It is.
Healthy and Dynamic Online
I have it
Communities.
here.
There it is. There it's available on Amazon. I pre-ordered it, so thank you very, very much. I really appreciate the chat. Always fun, always enjoyable. So from me in Paris
Hmm.
and from you in DC, thank you very much.
This was wonderful. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, John. So excited to do it, and excited to continue to have many conversations about this in the future.